Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If I could please get you to move to your seats, we'll start our second Distinguished Industry Panel. This second industry panel moves to Industry Cyber Solutions discussion. The panel members represent commercial applications that can be used for military, government, and civil uses and have a diverse viewpoint. Our moderator this afternoon is Deb Westfall, Managing Partner for Toffler Associates. Deb, the floor is yours.
So welcome back, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is a great panel, and I'm looking forward to the next 45 minutes here. We're all honored to be here in front of such a great crowd. Our task here was really to be bold and to be challenging, so hopefully we'll do that today. We were asked to discuss those non-technical issues, those non-technical solutions for how we're going to meet the future of cyber. So I want to open up a few remarks here, and then I'll introduce our panelists to share their thoughts. Society is in the midst of an accelerating, exciting, revolutionary transformation as a result of the shift from an industrial age to a knowledge age, and we're not prepared for that. And it was obvious by some of the comments this morning that we're all struggling with that, the commercial industry as well as government. This change is happening everywhere. Technology, business, government, economics, organizational structures, values, and our norms. Change is accelerating. Speed is key. This morning you heard about things that we're doing that is taking a year long, 2 years long. That's not fast enough. Speed is key. New opportunities for growth presented for this new economy are juxtaposed against the new threats and new challenges. Elliot opened up this morning with some facts and figures. I've got a couple facts and figures myself. 120 countries are developing InfoWar systems. We've got 800 million people around the globe that are on Facebook, and it's growing. We've got 100 million people that are on LinkedIn, and 100,000 that join every month. If you add up all the hours that people play on World of Warcraft, how many play World of Warcraft? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? There's a few, all right? If you add up all the numbers, or add up all the minutes and all the hours, 6 million years have been spent on World of Warcraft. In the last 9 years, and 11 million players. 30% of the world is connected to the internet. Yet, our government agencies, our commercial businesses are benchmarked off of 60, 70-year-old models, industrial age models. So constant novelty is norm, demanding the ability to anticipate what's next and prepare for, or better yet, gain from the challenge. In such a turbulent environment, competitive advantage is gained by organizations that are capable of identifying and adapting to this change. Agile organizations capable of nanosecond decisions. Increased competition advantage is gained by organizations that are capable of expanding beyond concentration of today's operations. We talked a lot this morning of today's operations. We need to expand beyond that. As commercial companies and government agencies move into the cyber future, especially as they move to the cloud and adopt new technologies to approach cybersecurity, they face challenges adapting their organizations and how they do businesses. Embracing new technologies without the appropriate changes to the organization's structure, strategy, processes, workforce, and relationships creates risks of the organization becoming desynchronized, losing effectiveness or efficiency on both an increasing competitive and unforgiving environment. So today our panelists will discuss experiences or observations of organizations that have successfully or unsuccessfully made these adaptations as they move forward into our cyber future and lessons from those experiences and observations. So let me take a moment here to introduce our panel. Our first panelist is Mr. John Higginbotham, Chairman and CEO of Blue Ridge Networks, where he addresses network and cybersecurity needs of government and industry customers. John was formerly the senior partner at SpaceVest Capital. He was a co-founder and senior executive of Intech and the product manager of HP's first microcomputers. Next beside him is Mr. Michael Glenn. He's the director of corporate security at CenturyLink, where he has oversight for cybersecurity and strategy, public policy, and large customer sales support. John is on the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committees for cloud computing in the cloud computing subcommittee. And they're looking at the national security and emergency preparedness issues involved with the issue of cloud computing for government services. Third, we have the Honorable James Longley, Executive Director, Advanced Technical Intelligence Association. Former Congressman Longley is an attorney, a Marine Corps veteran, communicator, and a long-standing technical analyst. Jim was selected to Congress in 1994 and was an active member of the House Armed Service Committee. Later, he was a senior technical analyst to the U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Technical Service and a senior advisor to the last 4 directors of the Missile Defense Agency. Last but not least, we have Mr. Glenn Veach, Chief Technology Officer, Relevant Security Corp., where he leads the technology strategy, planning, and implementation of cybersecurity solutions, providing federal trust, identifying management, information, communication security for government and commercial sectors. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to John to talk about the cost of cybersecurity and other issues you'd like to talk about.
Thank you, Deborah. Are we functional? And thank you to the Space Foundation for the opportunity to put this group together. I personally am pleased to see cybersecurity being correctly attached to the space activities. Thank you to all of you for participating. It's my privilege to represent Blue Ridge Networks as their chairman and CEO, but I wanted to make my comments more general in nature. Second chart, please. You know, the question that comes up is, next chart. Oops, sorry, I have it here. You know, why do we care about cybersecurity? Quite frankly, if you're a CEO or COO or CTO of an organization, if you're a director or commander of a command, you think of it as a cost. And particularly in a budget-constrained environment, whether you're talking about public or private dollars, why really care about cybersecurity? We know intuitively at the national security level the catastrophic exposures that exist for our men and women in uniform, but it's much deeper than that. Our enterprises are at risk for enterprise value. If you don't believe that, ask Sony or ask RSA Secure ID or many others that have unfortunately gone through a successful attack that has gotten to the core of their business. Our careers, if you're a CTO or a CIO of an organization that's had a successful attack, you know how much fun it is to be explaining that to your CEO of your board of directors after having spent millions of dollars on recommendations where theoretically you were protected. If you look at the efficiencies and the hassle factors and all the other budget-related issues involved, the costs are clearly clear. One that I'd really like to highlight, the cyber theft issue. We are in about, I think it's the 40th year of a negative trade balance here in the United States. The aggregate deficit, trade deficit in this country, is now in excess of $10 trillion. That does not include what we now have learned is the value of the intellectual properties that are being stolen every year by our adversaries, either for economic or national security purposes, the direct dollars that are stolen from bank accounts. It's turning into real money. So if we assume that 2011 government study is probably 2 or 3 years behind what's really been going on, we can, I think, legitimately say that we are in the hole somewhere between $5 to $8 trillion of intellectual property on top of an aggregate industrial trade deficit of probably close to $10 trillion. Imagine the discourse we would have at the public budget level, at the deficit discussion level, if we could recapture somewhere between 15 and 18 trillion dollars of value into the U.S. economy. This has national security implications. It has national economic considerations. And at the core of this, if we have emerged from an industrial society to a knowledge-based society, what that means is that the raw materials today aren't minerals and coal and oil. They're educated young people. And the means of production are not machines and factories, they're ideas. It's the innovation. It's this intellectual property. So at the core of the economic health of this country going forward, I would submit the implications are staggering as to not getting control of this situation. What's the typical spend? Why are we spending the dollars we spend? These are obviously understated dollars. Most of the organizations here internally that are cognizant and expending real resources on cybersecurity are spending 10 times or more of this every year for trying to protect themselves. But the typical enterprise out there, the medium-sized company, the financial or industrial or retail-oriented company is spending a few $100s a year trying to get their arms around this. And yet they're still exposed to a 70% probability or greater of a successful attack. And the cost of those attacks has been escalating, doubling and trebling every year. It's now a typical company is virtually certain, even spending $300 or $400 a year on their trying to protect themselves, that company is virtually certain of having a successful attack that's costing them $5 million or more. So why are we spending, what are we spending the money for? I was thoughtful this morning of General Vautrinot's comments with respect to, how 24th Air Force is looking at this in terms of prevention, detection, and containment. And these are exactly the kinds of things that I think our enterprises, whether they're public or private enterprises, are now starting to grapple with. Cybersecurity is a tough sale. You're selling someone on spending hard dollars on something not occurring. It's like selling insurance. I used to run an insurance company. You're protecting against something not securing. So it's very hard to get these return on investment concepts, and particularly in an economic constrained environment, crystallized. But I submit to you that the risk levels are reaching a point, and the costs of those levels are reaching a point where now the numbers are obvious. And I was particularly pleased to hear our industrial panel this morning confirm that the typical enterprise, whether it's public or private, is starting to understand that these are real risks, real costs, and that other types of economic quantifications are coming into the day-to-day decision process. So how do we handle this? I love the Paul Bear Bryant. Those of you that are football fans are certainly familiar with Bear Bryant and his tenure as first Kentucky and then Alabama's head coach. Defense wins championships. The offensive side of this business is very sexy. That's where a lot of us, like to spend our time, is on the SIG-int side of the world, because it's like, having flying a fighter jet instead of, a 4-engine beast. So it's the sexy side of the business. But it's defense that wins championships. And if we have a situation here where we're basically an open sieve, it means the intellectual property that is the underpinning of our effectiveness, whether it's at a national security level, an enterprise level, even a national economic level, is dangerously at risk. Forgive me for using, those of you that are over 50, you recognize the OSI model. Those of you that are digital natives instead of digital immigrants like us old guys, like to use some of the more modern models. But if this model still applies, it's the basic packet model where we break down applications, transit, and access. And if you really look at how most people have been attacking defense, we try and inspect it in at the applications layer. And if we can borrow a page from Deming, who invented Six Sigma quality assurance, that led to, fortunately, a lot of our industrial partners that adopted it found that it was core to their success. You cannot inspect quality in. You have to build it in. So then we looked at the transit layer, and SSL VPN is very popular, IPsec tools, all these various techniques to try and bring some form of security envelope into the transit layer. But let's understand where that works. TCPIP is the magic that invented this interoperable world. That's the internet. TCPIP was designed to create open connectivity. Its purpose was to open up connectivity among us. So here you are trying to put controls back into an architecture that was fundamentally designed to be open. I submit to you that's a design conflict, and therefore the source of a lot of the vulnerabilities that most that have tried to do it or rely strictly on that level of protection have run into problems. At the access layer, and I love this quote, it goes back to the ancient Greeks, you know, of all life's miseries, the bitterest is to know so much and have control over nothing. And I submit to you that's largely the circumstance right now. Inadequate attention to, shall we say, the access layers, the ComSec layer, the hardware layer. We have TPM chips, we don't use them. We have Ethernet. We don't think about it in the process of how do we control access. PPPK in its early forms was largely unsuccessful. It's matured. It works. There are many, many different forms. So we have a lot of tools available to us that as we start thinking a layered defense approach, and I think General Bosla said it extremely well this morning in terms of, you know, really getting this concept of defense in layers, that means actually defending at all layers. And you know, since my paycheck is Blue Ridge Networks, you know, our approach as a company, day one, it's now a 17-year-old company that's been doing this for a lot of years, was a situation where you can't trust anything, and you've got to design an architecture that covers through all the layers with a defensive concept. So I invite you to take a look at it. Defense needs more attention.
Good, good. Thanks, John. Michael is going to discuss the need for end-to-end supply chain security.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk. Cybersecurity is such a large topic. You can go on to in a lot of different areas. I'm going to talk about just a few thoughts about supply chain security, and not the entire topic of supply chain security, but one portion of it, and the changes that I think will have to occur within the supply chain in that organization, or within organizations in order to protect it. Anyone who is involved in the supply chain, which almost everyone is, knows just how difficult it is to try to verify the supply chain. You have the component origin, you know, and verification, which is in a global economy is incredibly difficult. You have, of course, the shipping, the module integration, testing. You have the final assembly and testing. The number of suppliers within the supply chain for any large organization is overwhelming to try to manage that. And all of this is occurring with an unprecedented level of threats and attacks going on, as we well know. You also have the introduction of cloud computing into this that adds a whole other factor as far as where is your information, who's controlling your information, how is it protected, what countries is your information residing in, how do you pull your information out of the cloud, and it really is a challenging problem. When you look at the fundamental risk equation, you know, risk is equal to vulnerability times threat times consequence, right? A lot of organizations have focused on the vulnerability side of that equation. I can patch servers, I can put in a firewall, I can protect my information, and then I'm good. But we all know that that's just not tenable anymore, that you have to look at the threat side in a very dynamic situation. And so I envision that what you're going to see going forward and what we're going to have to resource against are communities of trust. And you're going to have organizations that participate in multiple levels of community of trust, some larger, some smaller, where you act in both a competitive and a collaborative manner within those communities of trust. And I think you're seeing them now in the formative stages, and there's been a lot of communities of trust going back. So you see those, you know, within the DIB environment themselves, and the DICE and the DSIE. You also see those with NSIE. You see it in both the government arena, you see it in the private industry arena, and now you're seeing some actually effective communities of trust in the hybrid arena that you see going on now. And it's really encouraging for me to see some of these hybrid activities that become more effective, where information is being shared and it's actionable information that can actually happen. A A lot of the earlier communities of trust, especially with the government, shared information, but was human to human. And now we're starting to see it where we're seeing automated feeds within those communities of trust, and you're having intelligence applied to it, where those are applied in more real time. Now, I'm from a carrier, and so I'll be a little biased here, but I believe that network protections are also going to be critical and allow for protections of quickly integrating innovation and protections, especially protecting smaller suppliers within this who just don't have the capabilities. I also think you're going to see manufacturers have communities of trust with their suppliers, where their suppliers are required to share attack information and breach information, and then that's fed back in a cooperative manner where that's provided and you have a cooperative trust and set of protections in there. So I think companies are going to have to resource it in that manner, and that's how I see some of the visions of organizational changes that we'll need.
Excellent, excellent. Good, we'll turn it over to Jim to discuss how we're going to address our decision-making process to create agility within organizations.
Thanks, Deb, and thank you to the Space Foundation. The plan here is we'll each try to speak in under 5 minutes. I'm not going to tell you everything I know. I'd need at least 8 minutes to do that. The theme I want to emphasize is organizational agility, but the emphasis is not on the organization piece. If anything, we've adopted, in my view, too static a view of what an organization is, and not enough focus on what an organization needs to become. More so in an environment where if you pick on cybersecurity, you're essentially talking about a 4-second problem. The focus of my discussion, and I have several charts, is going to be structure and technology, and the interplay between the two of them, but more importantly, the role that people play in that construct. Because ultimately, structure and technology are tools. Tools are used by people, and we need to adapt our systems to recognize the human strengths and frailties of the people who use them. I'm going to offer a summary of 2,000 years of the rules of warfare in 20 seconds. Number one, you fight with what you've got. Number two is, over time, you get fancy. And number three is, if you get too fancy and you don't adapt, you lose. We've gotten to a point where we've gotten maybe a little bit fancy to the extent that we're not necessarily focusing on our objectives. We're focusing more on the process. I want to use this chart to provide two examples, one positive, one negative. This is a derivation of a flow chart, a process flow chart I did when I was providing some assistance to Secretary Wolfowitz's efforts on IEDs. And if you look at, the emphasis, if you look at the top operations block in the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice the words fulfill the commander's intent. Any military theorist focuses on the fact that you win a war by focusing on what the commander is trying to achieve. But yet, if you get any one of a number of briefs, particularly from the support establishment, you hear the words supporting the warfighter. I would submit there's a vast difference. Now, the reason there's a gray line between operations and support is with Goldwater Nichols, we essentially took our operational forces and made them joint. But at the same time, and that's why I have two additional vertical lines, we kept the support establishment separate. So essentially, one of the big problems I think we experienced in the IED crisis, and it was a crisis, I think our failure to adapt took us 3 to 5 years to get a good handle on the problem. It cost us lives. We can't afford to make this mistake again, but essentially the difficulties were in reconciling the objectives of the commanders on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan with what the support establishment was willing to do. We came up with a fancy process revolving around urgent needs. I'll stop there, and maybe that'll trigger a question. But the second and more positive example is on the left-hand side. And you'll be stunned to learn that the whole concept of civilian oversight of the military goes back to Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. And he was able to use the telegraph as a means to, as a civilian, manage the conduct of his generals at a distance. It's the first time that you did not have a unified command authority, essentially with a king running an army or a commander operating autonomously. the next chart, you know, when the Pentagon was first being considered, defense personnel were wasting time because they had to travel all over to Washington for meetings. And the idea was that we were going to consolidate everything in one building. In all seriousness, the Pentagon was designed to enable people and paper to move anywhere within the confines of the building within 10 minutes. And you won't guess what one of the major arguments against the construction of the Pentagon was. The feeling in Congress was, well, when the war's over, what will we do with all the extra space? Anyone paying attention to that? The traditional notion of defense missions and intelligence is defense destroys, we project power, the intelligence community informs. And I'm going to use one example from a program that's still underway, having some difficulties. I won't mention the specific program, except it's a radar that initially was designed to meet the requirements of the START treaties and for purposes of verifying the trajectory of Soviet missiles. The intention was to use that in the missile defense world, and believe it or not, there were people who seriously did not want to upgrade the radar's capabilities to meet what I'll call intercept quality data. So you had an anomaly where a radar was essentially being designed, presumably to support the Missile Defense Agency, but yet didn't have the capability to meet its objectives. Today, distinctions are nearly meaningless, and we've got technologies that work. I mean, clearly the intelligence community is actively involved from a threat standpoint. We really need to be looking at how can you take the same technologies and use them for multiple missions, whether it's tactical or strategic. I won't get into the details of the integration strategy, but essentially there are certain objectives that need to be reached to meet the needs of all the users. There's an ISR report done by the GAO. It said USDI has the authority to oversee DoD's ISR enterprise. However, the details make it difficult to manage and oversee. Again, I would submit that we've lost sight of some basic words of responsibility, authority, and the word authority, as it's used in the GAO report, doesn't apply when you have a situation where you've got multiple funding sources, different mission cultures, different acquisition systems, et cetera, and no process by which you can reconcile those differences. There's a positive story now taking place within the Defense Department as it relates to the ISR cloud. I use the word DITE, but DI2E, which is self-explanatory, but really the larger context is defense intelligence enterprise or even the joint information enterprise that we heard discussed this morning. You've got to have a collaborative structure. You've got to have authority and funding, tracking responsibility. You've got different other conflicts that need to be resolved, but there are important principles of effectiveness that need to be addressed. I won't get into the details of this last chart, but basically there are basic tools of effectiveness. The three words that I just used, but also the people aspect. You've got to foster trust, and you've got to have a situation where ideally people get to know each other and learn to trust each other through knowing each other based on working with them. My final chart here, a reading list. I would recommend highly the book by Mr. Thomas Wheeler, Mr. Lincoln's T-Mails, How Abraham Lincoln Used the Telegraph to Win the Civil War. It's very instructive on how savvy Lincoln was about the role that the telegraph played as a technology and how it changed the way he ran the war. Finally, I want to end on this note. My father used to say that people don't change as they get older, they get more like they were. If we keep getting more like we were and don't become more what we should be, we run the risk of losing everything we have. And I'll just finally say that we've been leaders in space and cyber. That's now on the edge. The Air Force has played a key role in our preeminence in those areas. And amongst the challenges today is let's see the Air Force do the same in the future. Thank you, Deb.
Good. Glenn, got some thoughts here
All right.
on root of trust and other things?
So my topic is how do you get all this innovation everybody's been talking about today and every cybersecurity conference you've been through in the last 2 years? There's a lot of discussion about how we need to take best practices from the commercial industry and bring it into government. But I think Riley, one of the earlier speakers, pointed out the fact that when he was paraphrasing Carl Sagan, that innovative ideas come in an ad hoc fashion. And that really is a key message that I think we need to understand. As a small company that's focused on cybersecurity, it's a totally different game than what you would typically find in larger organizations. I would argue that the commercial adoption needs to be turned on its head, that the adoption by government of best practices doesn't apply to cybersecurity. That in fact, if you go into the commercial enterprises, which I've worked in for many times, a long time in my career, cybersecurity innovation primarily really doesn't exist. It doesn't exist for a couple of reasons. There's a couple major hurdles that you have to overcome if you're in the commercial arena. One of them is standardization. And I was the chairperson of an IEEE standards body, and I can tell you standards bodies take a long time, they take a lot of resources, and they're fundamentally populated by large organizations who have the resources to do that. And those organizations typically aren't the innovators. In fact, I've had CTOs and CIOs of government organizations and major corporations at a recent security conference make the point that innovation comes from small companies. And when I stepped up to talk to one of those CTOs and said, I have innovation, I work with your company every day, and I haven't been able to get it into your organization. What's wrong? He said, simple. Take it to the market, take my market share away, and we'll buy you. That was his solution to the problem. So there's a barrier to innovation. It's around standardization. It's around certification. I would put forward to this body and to a lot of people, what is certification? Certification is understanding history, taking things that are historical in nature, producing tests around them, and determining whether somebody can pass that test. And the certification that we're putting in cybersecurity today is based on 30 and 40 years of legacy infrastructure. It's not based on innovation. It's not based on agility. It's not based on meeting today's needs. I'm sorry, it just isn't. It's based on 30, 40 years of standardization, and there are a lot of people at the gate checking checkboxes and see if you're FISMA compliant, if you're FIPS compliant, if you're JITIC compliant, if you're this compliant. And small organizations don't have the resources to address those. So I would argue that the government, the DoD, and particularly the Intel community, have an opportunity for innovation leadership. And the way you do innovation leadership is you become the first adopters. You don't wait for the commercial industries to be the first adopters, because if you're waiting for commercial industry to be the first adopter, it's not going to happen. They don't have the resources to do it. The government does have the resources, apart from the acquisition methods that have been beat to death here. But the typical methods of SBIRs and STTRs and DARPA and IARPA, the best thing we have today is DARPA's, fast track program, which I hope over the next year or two is very successful. But historically, what we have to offer small businesses like myself just don't work. They're taking you in the back door, not the front door, and it doesn't address the real problem today. So why do you bother? I want to put you a small analogy for you that I borrowed from a speaker from a SciNet conference last month in Stanford. He says, if we look at what it is we're trying to address, the problem that we're trying to address as organizations today, you just think of IPv4 versus IPv6. And the analogy is very simple. IPv4 represents a golf ball. IPv6 represents the sun of our solar system. That's the difference in the size of the magnitude of the problem. And what it is that IPv6 brings us, it's been talked about today earlier, mobility, embedded devices, SCADA, machine-to-machine interfaces, sensor networks. These are the things that we're trying to secure now. And can you secure them with the technology that hasn't secured our legacy systems for 30 and 40 years? I think not. So where do you find the innovation, and what do you need? Some of the speakers today have addressed that. You need a root of trust. You need to be able to secure the supply chain. You need to be able to find systems that will do these in real time. That means they need to be very fast, and they need to be very small, and they need to be embeddable, and they need to run all the time. And what that is an authentication. Authentication is part of security that we often overlook. And the reason we overlook it is because the traditional methods simply don't work for the reason that they're too slow and they're too big and cumbersome. Theoretically they work, scientifically they work, the algorithms work, but they don't work in practice. So I would submit as a proposition that if innovation is to happen, that this audience needs to be the first adopters and move it into the commercial sector next.
Excellent, excellent. So keep the questions coming from the audience here. We've got one from the audience I'd like to throw out to, we can start with Glenn first, and then I would like others to jump in here. If we assume all information is compromised, how does that change the way we do business?
Well, I think that's a good assumption, actually, that you should assume information is compromised. I think, you have to look at assuming that compromise is going to happen on your network, and you have to plan and prepare for that. And we're starting to transition out of that mode where we have, the classic perimeter defense. But that's really ties into what I was talking about, those communities of trust. We don't have the level of expertise at any one company or any one agency in order to completely protect ourselves. And that's why it's so important to have communities of trust. Now, I've seen the communities of trust grow. The larger they grow, the less trust you have within the organization. And so you have to have these small centers of communities of trust, but you also have large centers to provide baseline protections. But then you have smaller protections where you collaborate together. And it's very interesting in that model from an innovation perspective. We've done this, a number of times in different areas. For example, we're addressing the botnet problem right now. And if you saw, Chairman Janikowski just announced, that we have a U.S. Code of Conduct for botnets. Well, my team developed a botnet notification system about 7 years ago, and we put it into place. And it was interesting on the standardization around that Code of Conduct because there were all these arguments about why we couldn't do it. And I had to keep reminding people that, well, we've been doing it for 6 or 7 years now, so that doesn't really hold true. But I think you have to, that's a good example of a community that's working together with compromised systems that works collaboratively together to protect communities of interest, in this case, the residential U.S. population, for protections. And that's what we're going to have to move to.
John, did you have something to add to that? Okay.
Yeah,
1 second.
I recommend Joel Brenner's book, America the Vulnerable. Joel is a former Inspector General at NSA. He also was a National Counterintelligence Executive. This is what he has to say. SIPRNet and NIPRNet were thoroughly corrupted, but neither Central Command nor any other U.S. Joint Command can operate without them. You'd have to be delusional to believe this system isn't penetrated. You'd also have to be crazy not to believe that the Pentagon's top secret system, JWICS, isn't penetrated. Even the NSA now operates on the assumption that its systems are penetrated.
Good, so I've got another question here. In an asymmetric threat environment with dynamic and adaptive cyber adversary, how do we get ahead of the threat and continually adapt our defenses to mitigate and prevent these threats? So, John?
That one I would like to address. Getting out in front of this was the theme of this morning. And, I'll give you an example. We have one of our products, it's little bingo cards in every one of your satchels. It's called AppGuard. We've actually had this technology for 4 or 5 years. It's was embedded in some of our enterprise level deployments. We finally realized we had an incredible tool to defeat the mission of malware. It's not signature based. So it's an example of what Glenn was talking about, of bringing innovation, an example of what Mike was talking about protecting a root of trust. And it's really genius. Our CTO, one of the co-inventors, is here. It just blew me away. And we finally realized we had a fundamental tool that would put us out in front and not require us to actually detect the botnet or virus or what have you, but could fundamentally protect the core processes, whether you were an application layer, transit layer, operating system, even into some of the layer 1 functions that would buy the time for these other remediation capabilities to kick in, identify signatures, and start to redress. Because they are compromised. You cannot defeat botnets faster than they can morph to get in underneath the hood. You need a fundamentally different mindset on how to get out in front of it, to buy yourself the time to let these other tools come into existence. So here's a case where, all of the things that this panel was talking about, we were able to bring together in one simple, deployable, easy to install, unobtrusive, compatible with legacy networks. It's incredible. The innovations are out there. We need to find ways to bring them into the equation, and they can change the game.
Good. Got one last question here, and I want to turn this over to Glenn. Certifications are extremely expensive. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, my topic was innovation, so get rid of them. And I'm quite serious. Deb, in our preamble to this, when we were talking offline, made the point that you're not going to go find the kids who want to do cybersecurity who are lining up to take a test on 40 years of peak AI history. They're not going to do it. That's not how they break things. That's not how they penetrate systems. That's not how they think. They think outside the box, and what you're asking to do is put them back into the box. The reason I got in management in the first place is because I found a lot of guys that worked with me during my computer science programming years that were geniuses. They were bright programmers, but nobody knew how to manage them. And I could put up with all the BS in politics, and I decided to be a manager. And I don't program anymore. I don't know why. I should have gone back the other way. But the bottom line is, certifications are an encumbrance. They are very expensive. And sometimes the government can help pay for them. They're, mentor-protege programs and those sorts of things. But unfortunately, I think they're putting up more hurdles and more roadblocks than need be.
Good. So as we wrap up this panel, and appreciate all your time and listening to us, just want to leave you with a few thoughts here. We can't keep benchmarking off of the past. We need this innovation, and we need to be courageous, and we need to have this disruptive innovation. It's not the evolutionary. It has to be disruptive. And that includes not only in our technology, but it includes in how we organize, how we hire, our processes inside, our organizations, how we acquire, how we manage, the relationships that we have, our organizational relationships. We've got to overcome our organizational biases. It's the way that it's always been done. This is the organization that we have. We've got to continue to manage what we have. No, we don't. We have to break things down. And we have to recreate these things for this new time that we find ourselves in history. And we need speed. We need to do this quickly. We cannot take years to do this. The speed at which we need to move has to be in those nanosecond decision timeframes. And we need to look and operate in a very, very different way than we have in the past. And it's scary. It's very scary. But we're in this revolution in society, moving from this industrial-based society to this knowledge-based society. And we need revolutionaries, and in this room, we have those revolutionaries. And we need to be bold, and we need to be courageous, and we need to knock down those barriers. So appreciate your time, and I'd like to give a hand to our fine panelists, and thank you very much.